Today, an exploration commences into one of the most profoundly significant occurrences within Jewish annals and the ancient world at large: the catastrophic obliteration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which transpired in 70 CE. The year is precisely 70 CE, a period when the formidable Roman Empire wielded its imperial dominion with unparalleled might. From the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-drenched lands of Aegyptus, and from the Iberian Peninsula to the Levantine territories of Syria, the emblematic Aquila standards of Rome cast their imposing shadow across the entirety of the then-known globe. Yet, within a diminutive, yet fiercely independent enclave of this expansive imperium, specifically in the province of Judea, discontent and unrest had been simmering for a considerable duration. The Jewish populace, distinguished by their deeply ingrained monotheistic religious tenets and an unyielding spirit of autonomy, had consistently found themselves ill at ease and fundamentally incompatible with the imposition of Roman suzerainty. Now, following a relentless 4-year period of savage conflict, the paramount emblem of Jewish spiritual conviction and collective identity, the revered Second Temple in Jerusalem, teetered precariously on the precipice of utter annihilation. To comprehensively grasp the intricate genesis of this cataclysmic juncture, it becomes imperative to momentarily reverse the flow of time and meticulously scrutinize the intricate tapestry of religious, political, and socio-economic discord that inexorably culminated in what chroniclers designate as the First Jewish-Roman War, or, as it is occasionally referenced, the Great Revolt. The narrative commences not with the immediate siege itself, but rather with a preceding span of many decades, characterized by escalating exasperation, profound cultural dissonance, and a species of administrative ineptitude so pronounced that it would undoubtedly elicit discomfort, even among contemporary governmental functionaries. The Roman Empire, notwithstanding its formidable military prowess and its remarkable organizational acumen, often adopted a somewhat idiosyncratic methodology for governing its widely disparate territories. Rather than imposing a uniform, rigid administrative framework across all its dominions, the Romans frequently permitted the perpetuation of localized customs and indigenous religious practices, provided that tribute obligations were punctually discharged and any inclinations toward insurrection were effectively suppressed. This approach generally proved efficacious in the majority of regions, yet Judea presented a singularly formidable array of challenges. The Jewish faith, characterized by its uncompromising monotheism and its meticulously elaborated ritualistic observances, stood in stark contrast to any religious system the Romans had previously encountered within the vast expanse of their empire. The Second Temple, which had been painstakingly reconstructed subsequent to the Babylonian exile circa 516 BCE, transcended the mere definition of a religious edifice. It constituted the vibrant, pulsating core of Jewish civilization. It was within its hallowed precincts that sacrificial rites were performed, where devout pilgrims journeyed from every corner of the Mediterranean world, and where the high priest officiated the most sacrosanct rituals of the Jewish spiritual tradition. Furthermore, the temple functioned as an immense economic engine, generating prodigious wealth through the collection of the temple tax remitted by Jewish communities throughout the diaspora and via the incessant influx of pilgrims who converged upon Jerusalem for the celebration of the major festivals. However, it was precisely at this juncture that affairs became exceedingly convoluted and, frankly, verged on the ludicrous. The Romans, in their boundless sagacity, concluded that the optimal strategy for governing Judea involved the installation of a succession of client kings and procurators who appeared to have been chosen primarily on the basis of their perceived ability to maximize imperial revenue while simultaneously exhibiting a minimal comprehension of local customs and sensibilities. This administrative approach was akin to entrusting an individual utterly unfamiliar with computing technology with the oversight of a sophisticated information technology department. Such an arrangement, while theoretically conceivable, was highly unlikely to yield a favorable outcome. The societal tensions commenced a serious upward trajectory during the imperium of Emperor Caligula, who conceived the utterly preposterous notion of demanding that his own effigy be installed within the sacred confines of the temple. For anyone possessing even a rudimentary understanding of Jewish religious strictures, this proposition was roughly equivalent to suggesting that swine-flesh cheeseburgers be offered as sacrificial oblations upon the altar. The Jewish populace reacted with profound horror, and it was solely Caligula's opportune demise in 41 CE that averted what could have precipitated an immediate and widespread insurrection. A relative calm descended upon the region during the reign of Emperor Claudius, who generally endeavored to demonstrate deference toward Jewish customs. Nevertheless, the truly intractable difficulties began to manifest when Nero ascended to imperial power and proceeded to appoint a series of procurators who seemingly regarded their administrative posts principally as avenues for personal aggrandizement. These officials, bearing names such as Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus, governed with an unholy amalgam of rampant corruption, profound insensitivity, and what can only be accurately characterized as breathtaking incompetence. The precarious situation was further exacerbated by the proliferation of various Jewish factions, each espousing its own distinct philosophy regarding the appropriate response to Roman dominion. The Pharisees, whose primary preoccupation was with religious jurisprudence and observance, generally advocated for a policy of pragmatic accommodation with Rome, provided that their religious liberties were duly respected. The Sadducees, who exercised control over the temple hierarchy, possessed a vested interest in preserving the extant order, given that their authority and affluence were inextricably linked to the temple system. However, more radicalized groups were simultaneously emerging. The Zealots, as they subsequently became known, fervently believed that the Almighty would not perpetually countenance Roman suzerainty over the Holy Land, and that it was the sacred obligation of devout Jews to actively resist foreign subjugation. These individuals were not merely religious extremists. Many were genuinely motivated by legitimate grievances pertaining to oppressive taxation, pervasive corruption, and the gradual erosion of traditional Jewish autonomy. Furthermore, there existed the Sicarii, a clandestine cadre of assassins who derived their appellation from the distinctive curved daggers they habitually carried, concealed within the folds of their garments. Their modus operandi involved the targeted assassination of Romans and Jewish collaborators in densely populated public spaces, after which they would seamlessly vanish back into the milling crowds. This tactic fostered a pervasive atmosphere of perpetual menace, rendering the maintenance of civic order exceedingly challenging when one could never ascertain whether a seemingly innocuous individual in the marketplace harbored a hidden weapon and considered one a legitimate target for elimination. The catalyst that finally ignited the conflagration of the Great Revolt materialized in 66 CE. Much like numerous historical calamities, it originated from an ostensibly minor incident that rapidly spiraled into an uncontrollable catastrophe. The procurator Gessius Florus, who was widely regarded, even by Roman standards, as singularly corrupt and exceptionally brutal, made the audacious decision to expropriate silver from the temple treasury, ostensibly to compensate for outstanding tax arrears. This act constituted not merely a crime of theft, it was an act of sacrilege of the most profound magnitude. The Jewish populace of Jerusalem reacted with fervent protests and outspoken derision. Some even circulated a collection basket, sarcastically soliciting donations for the impoverished procurator Florus. Florus, it would appear, was not an individual endowed with a particularly refined sense of humor, for he responded to this public mockery by dispatching military detachments into the city to apprehend the protesters and to crucify several prominent citizens. This draconian response ignited widespread riots, which in turn provoked further brutal repression, which then begat additional riots. And before anyone could fully comprehend the rapidly unfolding events, Jerusalem found itself engulfed in open rebellion. The situation escalated with alarming swiftness when Eleazar ben Ananias, who served as the captain of the temple guard, successfully persuaded the priestly caste to cease offering the customary daily sacrifice for the Roman emperor. While this action might appear inconsequential to contemporary observers, within the ideological framework of Roman imperial governance, it amounted to an unequivocal declaration of independence. The imperial sacrifice constituted one of the primary mechanisms through which subject peoples demonstrated their fealty to Rome, and its cessation was universally understood by all parties involved as an overt act of rebellion. What ensued was a convoluted and frequently tumultuous conflict that would rage for 4 protracted years and ultimately fundamentally reconfigure the entire landscape of Judaism and early Christianity. The rebels initially achieved considerable successes, managing to expel the Roman military garrison from Jerusalem and decisively defeat a Syrian legion dispatched to quell the unrest. For a fleeting interval, it appeared conceivable that the Jews might indeed succeed in completely casting off the yoke of Roman domination. The rebels established their own provisional government, meticulously minted their own coinage emblazoned with defiant slogans such as Freedom of Zion and Jerusalem the Holy, and commenced preparations for what they instinctively knew would be a massive Roman counteroffensive. However, it is precisely at this juncture that the narrative acquires some of the tragic absurdity that appears to characterize so many historical disasters. The Jewish insurgents expended nearly as much energy engaging in internecine conflict as they did confronting the Roman legions. The rebel movement was splintered into a multitude of disparate factions, each possessing its own distinct leadership, its own territorial spheres of influence within Jerusalem, and its own divergent conceptions concerning the proper prosecution of the war. There were the Zealots, spearheaded by figures such as Eleazar ben Simon, who controlled the inner courtyards of the temple. There were the adherents of John of Gischala, who held sway over the northern sector of the city. And there was Simon bar Giora, who commanded the upper city and a substantial portion of the surrounding rural areas. These rival groups dedicated an inordinate amount of time and effort to battling one another, deliberately incinerating each other's food provisions, and generally rendering the Roman task of conquest considerably less arduous. It is pertinent to momentarily pause here and contemplate the sheer peculiarity of this predicament. Here stood a diminutive nation confronting the full, unbridled might of the formidable Roman Empire, the very same empire that had subjugated Gaul, decisively vanquished Cleopatra, and brought to heel diverse tribes from the frigid reaches of Scotland to the scorching expanses of the Sahara. And yet, instead of forging a unified front against this existential menace, the rebels were embroiled in what amounted to a three-way civil war within the very confines of their own capital city. This situation could be likened to the American colonies in 1776, choosing to engage in internecine warfare amongst themselves instead of confronting the British, albeit with an amplified degree of religious fervor and a considerably greater abundance of dramatic pronouncements concerning divine intervention. Concurrently, Emperor Nero had entrusted Vespasian, one of Rome's most seasoned and accomplished generals, with the paramount mission of crushing the rebellion. Vespasian was a pragmatic, meticulously methodical commander who acutely understood that the key to decisively defeating the Jewish insurgents lay not in a precipitous direct assault on Jerusalem, but rather in systematically dismantling the rebel strongholds throughout Judea, thereby severing the capital city from any conceivable prospect of succor or resupply. Vespasian's military campaign constituted a veritable masterpiece of Roman military efficacy. The Roman general initiated his formidable campaign in the northern region of Galilee, where he encountered the defiant Jewish forces under the command of a youthful priest and distinguished aristocrat named Joseph ben Matthias. This individual would subsequently achieve considerable renown under his adopted Roman appellation, Flavius Josephus. Josephus's extensive historical writings would ultimately serve as the foremost chronicle for these tumultuous occurrences. However, the reliability of his narrative is inherently intricate, given his pivotal decision to defect during the conflict and his subsequent lifelong endeavor to elucidate and vindicate his conduct to both his Roman patrons and his former Jewish compatriots. The protracted encirclement of Jotapata, the stronghold where Josephus himself was positioned, stands as a quintessential illustration of Roman siege methodology at its zenith of sophistication and lethal efficacy. The Roman legions meticulously engineered an enormous earthen ramp leading directly to the formidable city walls, concurrently erecting towering siege engines and deploying every conceivable stratagem from their extensive repertoire of siegecraft. Conversely, the beleaguered defenders mounted a fierce and valiant resistance, unleashing torrents of scalding oil, volleys of arrows, and even massive stones hurled from the ramparts in a desperate bid to impede the relentless Roman incursion. Josephus's vivid chronicles recount episodes of astounding valor and concurrent acts of shocking savagery, as combatants on both sides engaged with the profound desperation of individuals acutely aware that capitulation portended either a swift demise or the ignominy of enslavement. Upon the eventual collapse of Jotapata, following an arduous siege lasting 47 days, the vast majority of its valiant defenders perished. However, Josephus, with remarkable fortune, successfully concealed himself within a cavern alongside 40 other remaining survivors. As per his personal historical narrative, the beleaguered contingent collectively resolved to embrace self-annihilation rather than endure the disgrace of capture. Yet Josephus, displaying a persuasive acumen, swayed them to draw lots to systematically determine the sequence in which each man would dispatch the next, through what he fervently asserted was an act of divine intervention, though it bears a striking resemblance to astute and calculating manipulation. Josephus providentially emerged as one of the final two individuals remaining alive. At this critical juncture, he adeptly persuaded his solitary companion that they ought to yield to the Romans rather than fulfill the grim terms of their collective suicide pact. It is precisely at this juncture that Josephus's unfolding narrative assumes a character that is either profoundly inspiring or deeply cynical, contingent entirely upon one's individual interpretation. When subsequently presented before the formidable Vespasian, Josephus, rather than persisting in any semblance of defiance, audaciously declared that he had been granted a divine revelation foretelling Vespasian's ascension to the imperial throne. This pronouncement represented an extraordinarily audacious maneuver, particularly considering that Nero remained very much alive and firmly ensconced on the Roman imperial seat, and any prediction concerning the demise of an emperor was universally regarded as an act of treason punishable by death. Nevertheless, Josephus gambled shrewdly, wagering that the prevailing political climate within Rome was sufficiently volatile and precarious for his improbable prophecy to materialize. And against all odds, it astonishingly did. In 68 CE, the tyrannical Emperor Nero brought an end to his own life, thereby plunging the vast Roman Empire into a tumultuous period of internecine strife, famously chronicled as the Year of the Four Emperors. During this chaotic epoch, figures such as Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each briefly grasped the reins of power before the formidable legions loyal to Vespasian unequivocally proclaimed him as the rightful emperor. With this dramatic turn of events, Josephus's status transformed instantaneously from that of a vanquished insurgent to a revered prophet whose extraordinary predictions had been miraculously vindicated. Consequently, Vespasian not only granted him his liberty, but also bestowed upon him the invaluable privilege of Roman citizenship and even the prestigious family name of Flavius. This remarkable trajectory stands as one of history's most astoundingly successful career reorientations, albeit one achieved at the profound and enduring cost of being perpetually branded as a betrayer by a significant portion of his own Jewish people. Concurrently, as these momentous and dramatic political upheavals were unfolding within the heart of Rome, the plight of Jerusalem spiraled into an increasingly dire and precarious state. The sacred city had become severely overcrowded with a vast influx of refugees fleeing the embattled countryside, a demographic surge that placed an unbearable strain upon its already insufficient food provisions and rudimentary sanitation infrastructure, which were barely adequate for its customary populace. Within the city's confines, the disparate Jewish rebel factions persisted in their ruinous internal warfare, with each militant group asserting control over distinct sectors of Jerusalem and regarding their fellow Jews as adversaries nearly as perilous as the encroaching Roman legions. The most profoundly tragic consequence of this self-destructive internal strife was the wanton obliteration of vital food resources. Within the confines of a city enduring a relentless siege, sustenance transcends mere monetary value, becoming quite literally more precious than gold itself. Despite this undeniable reality, the warring rebel factions, in their relentless internal hostilities, systematically and repeatedly set fire to each other's granaries and storehouses. For instance, the adherents of John of Gischala would incinerate provisions under the dominion of Simon Bar-Giorra's faction, who would in turn exact vengeance by obliterating the food reserves of the Zealots, perpetuating an incessant and ruinous cycle of reciprocal demolition. It is exceedingly challenging to conceive of a more profoundly self-defeating and counterproductive strategic approach, especially when confronted by an adversary whose principal and most devastating tactic was explicitly designed to compel the city's capitulation through systematic starvation. The profound religious dimension inherent in the conflict introduced yet another stratum of intricate complexity and poignant tragedy to the already desperate circumstances. A substantial number of the Jewish insurgents harbored an earnest and unwavering conviction that divine providence would assuredly intercede to safeguard both Jerusalem and its sacred temple, echoing the miraculous deliverance of the city from the Assyrian onslaught during the reign of King Hezekiah. While this fervent faith undeniably imbued them with extraordinary courage and unyielding resolve, it regrettably also precipitated a series of spectacularly ill-advised strategic choices. Presented with the agonizing dilemma of either negotiating a conditional surrender that might potentially preserve the hallowed temple and the city itself, or engaging in a suicidal fight to the last man in the unwavering belief that divine intervention was on the very cusp of manifestation. A significant proportion of the defenders unequivocally opted for the latter, more fatalistic course of action. The already dire situation was rendered even more labyrinthine by the emergence of numerous self-proclaimed prophets and messianic aspirants who vociferously declared that the ultimate epoch was imminent and that the Almighty was on the verge of establishing His divine dominion upon the earth. These charismatic personages garnered substantial adherents among the increasingly desperate populace, offering a glimmer of hope amidst overwhelming despair. However, their fervent assurances of supernatural deliverance frequently incited individuals to undertake actions that were, from a purely military standpoint, utterly suicidal. This serves as a quintessential illustration of the paradoxical nature of profound religious zeal. While it possesses the capacity to ignite extraordinary acts of heroism and profound self-sacrifice, it can simultaneously engender catastrophically flawed judgment when applied to the pragmatic exigencies of military strategy and logistical planning. Upon Vespasian's ascension to the imperial throne in 69 CE, he strategically delegated the prosecution of the ongoing Judean war to his son, Titus, who was at that juncture approximately 30 years of age and ardently desirous of distinguishing himself as a formidable military commander. Titus, in numerous respects, presented a striking antithesis to his pragmatic and meticulously methodical father. He embodied youthful vigor, boundless ambition, and an inherent predilection for grand, dramatic gestures. Furthermore, he was reputedly a man of considerable handsomeness and engaging charm, attributes that would assume significant relevance later in the historical narrative, when he embarked upon a renowned romantic liaison with the Jewish princess Berenice, who was the sister of King Agrippa II. Titus made his formidable entrance outside the perimeter of Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE, commanding an impressive contingent comprising 4 elite legions, specifically the 5th Macedonica, 10th Fretensis, 12th Fulminata, and 15th Apollinaris, supplemented by a multitude of diverse auxiliary units and an extensive array of sophisticated siege apparatus. The cumulative strength of this Roman expeditionary force likely approximated 60,000 seasoned soldiers, thereby constituting one of the most substantial armies Rome had ever marshaled for a singular military campaign. The implicit message conveyed by such an overwhelming display of martial power was unequivocally clear. The Roman Empire harbored no intention of countenancing any further insurrections within the province of Judea. The subsequent siege of Jerusalem evolved into one of the most savage and profoundly sorrowful episodes recorded in the annals of ancient history. The entire urban expanse was meticulously encircled by an immense and impenetrable siege barrier, known as a circumvallation, a formidable edifice that effectively precluded any individual from either entering or departing the beleaguered city. This strategic construction represented a quintessential element of conventional Roman siegecraft, meticulously engineered to deny the defenders any possibility of receiving vital provisions or military reinforcements, while simultaneously thwarting any attempts at escape. The resultant psychological impact on the trapped inhabitants was utterly devastating. Those confined within the city walls understood with chilling clarity that their only remaining alternatives were an improbable victory or an inevitable demise. The elaborate Roman siege infrastructure erected around Jerusalem constituted a veritable masterpiece of military engineering, even when judged by the exceptionally high standards of Roman ingenuity. This imposing circumvallation, extending for approximately 4.5 meters in length, was strategically punctuated by 13 formidable forts, each judiciously situated at critical vantage points encircling the city. Remarkably, this extensive barrier was constructed with astonishing rapidity, completed in a mere 3 days, a testament to the unparalleled efficiency and formidable organizational capabilities of Roman military engineers when operating under intense motivation. Josephus, who observed this prodigious undertaking firsthand from the Roman encampment, characterized its construction as an almost supernatural display of expeditious execution and meticulous coordination. Within the beleaguered city's confines, the predicament grew progressively more dire and utterly desperate. The urban populace, dramatically augmented by a deluge of refugees, might have swelled to an estimated 600,000 individuals, or even surpassed that figure, all compressed into an area that was inherently overpopulated even under tranquil conditions. Crucially, the city's food provisions, already severely diminished by the internecine conflicts between factions, commenced to vanish entirely. Water became a scarce commodity, subjected to stringent rationing, while the fragile sanitation systems catastrophically failed under the immense burden. Consequently, virulent diseases began their relentless propagation, and the grim tally of fatalities escalated with each passing day. Yet, arguably, the most profoundly heart-wrenching dimension of the siege was the insidious manner in which it fractured the very fabric of families and communities. Josephus meticulously chronicles harrowing vignettes of parents savagely contending with their own offspring over meager morsels of sustenance, of individuals succumbing to death in the thoroughfares, while others callously stepped over their lifeless forms, and of the utter dissolution of conventional societal bonds under the crushing weight of famine and existential despondency. He recounts the particularly ghastly narrative of a prosperous woman identified as Mary, daughter of Eleazar, who was driven to such an extreme state of desperation that she tragically slew and consumed her own infant son. A tale of such profound horror that even Josephus, typically disinclined towards emotional expression, appears visibly perturbed by its recounting. The Roman offensive against the embattled city unfolded in a series of calculated stages, with Titus systematically dismantling the formidable outer defensive perimeters before progressively advancing towards the more interior fortifications. The Jewish defenders, imbued with an unyielding and desperate valor, deployed every conceivable stratagem to impede the relentless Roman encroachment. They ingeniously excavated subterranean tunnels beneath the colossal Roman siege works, endeavoring to induce their collapse. Furthermore, they executed sudden, daring sorties from the protective confines of their walls, launching swift and brutal assaults upon the Roman construction battalions. Utilizing their own formidable arsenal, they employed catapults and ballistae to unleash a devastating barrage of projectiles upon the entrenched Roman positions. Among the myriad harrowing incidents of the siege, one of the most profoundly dramatic episodes transpired when the Roman forces ultimately succeeded in breaching the formidable outer wall and initiated their fierce assault upon the second layer of fortifications. The ensuing combat was characterized by such an extraordinary intensity that Titus himself, it is recounted, felt compelled to unsheathe his personal sword and actively engage in the brutal melee, thereby galvanizing his soldiers through his direct and inspiring personal example. The Jewish inhabitants, battling with an existential fury for the sanctity of their homes and their hallowed city, fiercely disputed control over every single thoroughfare and every individual structure. Conversely, the Romans, as consummate professional soldiers with an illustrious reputation to uphold, were equally resolute in their unwavering determination to unequivocally affirm their martial supremacy. The pivotal moment arrived when Roman forces successfully seized the Antonia fortress, a formidable bastion strategically positioned to overlook the revered temple complex. This conquest dealt a devastating blow to Jewish morale, as the fortress had long been regarded as virtually impregnable, a symbol of resistance. From their vantage point within the Antonia, Roman catapults unleashed a relentless barrage of stones and flaming arrows directly upon the temple courts, effectively halting the daily sacrifices, which constituted the very core of Jewish religious observance. Despite the increasingly desperate circumstances, a significant number of defenders steadfastly refused to capitulate. The temple itself transformed into the ultimate redoubt, its courts and chambers teeming with thousands of combatants and non-combatants alike. The rebels clung to the profound conviction that their deity would never permit his sacred dwelling to be desecrated by pagan hands, a faith that sustained them even as the formidable Roman siege engines relentlessly pounded the protective walls surrounding them. General Titus, for his part, appeared genuinely torn regarding the fate of the temple. Historical accounts, particularly those from Josephus, indicate that the Roman commander harbored a desire to preserve the edifice, acknowledging its profound architectural grandeur and foreseeing that its destruction would be perceived as an egregious act of cultural vandalism across the vast Roman Empire. The Romans, despite their formidable reputation for ruthless efficiency, typically displayed a degree of deference towards indigenous religious customs, and the utter obliteration of such a paramount religious monument would, indeed, establish a perilous precedent. However, the grim realities on the ground rendered any prospect of preservation increasingly untenable. The temple complex itself had been transformed into an unyielding stronghold, with Jewish combatants utilizing its consecrated structures as strategic military positions. Consequently, every single courtyard had to be painstakingly captured through direct assault, and every chamber systematically cleared of its entrenched defenders. The ferocity and close-quarters nature of the fighting escalated to such an extent that it became virtually impossible to distinguish between those engaged in combat and innocent civilians, or to differentiate between hallowed spaces and mere military emplacements. The climactic assault on the temple commenced on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, according to the ancient Jewish calendar. Roman engineers had meticulously constructed colossal siege ramps leading up to the temple walls, and their powerful battering rams pounded incessantly, day and night, against the venerable stones. The cacophony must have been overwhelming. The thunderous crash of the rams, the guttural shouts of the legionaries, and the piercing screams of the injured, all reverberating off the sacred walls of what had once been the most hallowed sanctuary in all of Judaism. The defenders, fueled by an extraordinary desperation, fought with the profound understanding that they were contending for something far greater than their individual lives. Their struggle encompassed their entire cultural fabric, their sacred covenant with God, and the very essence of their identity as a people. They hurled themselves against the unyielding Roman shields with a suicidal bravery, preferring death to the defilement of their holy precinct. Many genuinely believed that, at the 11th hour, their God would intervene with a miraculous salvation, just as he had done countless times throughout their storied history. Yet, no such divine intervention materialized. On the 9th day of Av in the year 70 CE, Roman soldiers finally breached the temple's formidable defenses and surged into its sacred courts. What transpired next is a moment in history marked by conflicting narratives from various sources, with the definitive truth likely residing in a synthesis of these accounts. According to Josephus, whose writings often aim to portray Titus in the most favorable light for his Roman readership, a Roman soldier, acting without direct orders, flung a flaming torch through one of the temple windows. The ensuing conflagration spread with such rapidity and intensity that it quickly spiraled beyond any hope of control. In this rendition, Titus was, in fact, endeavoring to salvage the magnificent edifice when the uncontrollable flames rendered preservation an impossibility. Other historical records, however, imply a more deliberate act of destruction, suggesting that Roman soldiers systematically ignited fires throughout the complex as an integral component of their relentless assault. Ultimately, the precise genesis of the fire likely held little consequence for those who witnessed the unfolding catastrophe. What truly mattered was the stark reality that the Second Temple, the spiritual epicenter of Jewish religious life for more than 5 centuries, was engulfed in flames. The inferno first devoured the wooden components, the grand doors, the massive roof beams, and the intricate internal partitions. Subsequently, the heat intensified to such an extreme degree that even the colossal stone walls began to fracture and crumble. The precious gold and silver embellishments, once gleaming, melted and streamed down the scorching walls like molten tears. The psychological devastation wrought by witnessing the temple's fiery destruction was profound for the Jewish defenders. This was not merely a military defeat. It represented a theological crisis of the highest magnitude. How could God permit the destruction of his own sacred dwelling? How could the elaborate sacrificial system, divinely ordained by Moses himself, simply cease to exist? Many of the defenders, observing the flames consume the Holy of Holies, simply abandoned their fight, allowing themselves to be slain where they stood, overwhelmed by despair. Yet the tragedy was far from over. As the temple burned, Thousands of individuals, fighters, priests, and countless civilians found themselves trapped within the sprawling complex. Some perished at the hands of Roman soldiers, others succumbed to the raging inferno, and still more were crushed by collapsing walls and roofs. Josephus asserts that 1 million people died during the entire siege, although contemporary historians generally regard this figure as significantly inflated. Even assuming a considerably lower actual death toll, it undeniably represented a catastrophe of immense proportions. Once the Romans had secured the temple complex, they embarked upon a systematic plunder of every valuable item that had escaped the ravages of the fire. The temple treasury, which had amassed considerable wealth from Jewish communities spread across the entire Mediterranean world, was thoroughly emptied. Sacred vessels, ceremonial objects, and invaluable religious artifacts were meticulously carried away to Rome as spoils of war. The iconic golden menorah, the revered table of showbread, and other significant items from the temple would subsequently be prominently displayed in Titus's triumphant parade through the grand thoroughfares of Rome. The destruction of the temple was swiftly followed by the methodical demolition of much of the remaining city of Jerusalem. The Romans, resolute in their determination to establish a stark example that would effectively deter any future insurrections, decreed that the city's formidable walls be razed and the majority of its buildings annihilated. Only the western wall of the temple complex, alongside 3 prominent towers from Herod's palace, was permitted to remain, serving as an enduring testament to what had once stood there and a potent symbol of the overwhelming power of Rome. The human toll exacted by the protracted siege was utterly staggering. Those who managed to survive the brutal fighting and the consuming flames faced an equally grim destiny. Thousands were forcibly sold into slavery, dispatched to toil in arduous mines, or to meet their demise in gladiatorial contests across the vast empire. The elderly and the infirm were simply executed, as their lack of economic utility as slaves rendered them valueless. Children were cruelly separated from their parents, families were torn asunder, and an entire way of life was, in essence, irrevocably brought to an end. However, perhaps the most profound consequence of the temple's destruction transcended the purely physical, manifesting instead as a deep religious and cultural upheaval. For centuries, Judaism had revolved around the temple and its intricate sacrificial system. The role of the high priest, the observance of daily sacrifices, and the significance of pilgrimage festivals, all these foundational elements of Jewish religious practice abruptly ceased. It was as if the entire foundational structure of Jewish civilization had been violently yanked out from beneath the people, leaving them adrift. The immediate and pressing question confronting the survivors was simple yet profoundly existential. How does one continue to practice Judaism without the temple? The sacrificial system became inoperative without the central altar in Jerusalem. The venerable priesthood found its primary function rendered obsolete. The traditional pilgrimage festivals became impossible to properly observe. It seemed entirely plausible that Judaism itself might simply vanish, gradually absorbed into the prevailing Greco-Roman culture, much like numerous other subjugated peoples had been. Yet, it is at this juncture that the historical narrative takes an unforeseen turn. For the destruction of the temple, catastrophic though it undoubtedly was, paradoxically catalyzed one of the most remarkable religious transformations in human history. A pioneering group of rabbis, spearheaded by influential figures such as Yohanan ben Zakkai, had already commenced the development of novel forms of Jewish practice that were not contingent upon the temple's existence. Their innovative approach emphasized prayer as a substitute for sacrifice, study as an alternative to pilgrimage, and positioned the home and synagogue as the new spiritual epicenters of religious life, replacing the now absent temple. Yohanan ben Zakkai himself is associated with a fascinating legend that vividly illustrates the pragmatic adaptability that would come to define post-temple Judaism. According to tradition, he was clandestinely smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin during the height of the siege. He then proceeded to the Roman camp, where he audaciously requested Vespasian's permission to establish a scholarly academy in the town of Yavne. This seemingly modest request was, in fact, the foundational act that would give rise to rabbinic Judaism, the resilient form of the religion that has steadfastly endured to the present day. The ensuing transformation was neither facile nor instantaneous. Intense debates raged over which established practices could be successfully adapted and which, regrettably, had to be entirely abandoned. Certain factions, such as the Sadducees, whose identity and practices were inextricably linked to the temple system, simply vanished from the historical record. Other groups, like the Essenes, who had already deliberately distanced themselves from mainstream Jewish society, also gradually faded into obscurity. However, the Pharisees, with their profound emphasis on oral law and a flexible interpretation of Scripture, ultimately furnished the robust framework for Judaism's remarkable survival and subsequent evolution. For Judaism's enduring survival and profound evolution, the nascent Christian community, which in those formative years largely comprised individuals of Jewish heritage, grappled with a profound hermeneutical dilemma. A segment of believers perceived the temple's obliteration as a potent corroboration of Jesus' prophetic declarations concerning the obsolescence of the antiquated Mosaic covenant, signaling a new spiritual epoch. Conversely, a different faction wrestled with the theological conundrum of divine permission, questioning how the Almighty could countenance such an immense calamity to afflict his covenanted populace. This cataclysmic event in Jerusalem inexorably propelled Christianity towards a definitive severance from its ancestral Jewish patrimony, culminating in its metamorphosis into a faith primarily embraced by non-Jewish adherents. The triumph of the Roman legions was commemorated with an ostentatious display of imperial magnificence, entirely consonant with their tradition of celebrating martial successes. In 71 CE, the victorious general Titus made his grand re-entry into the Eternal City, where he was bestowed with a triumph, the paramount accolade that the Roman Republic, and subsequently the Empire, could confer upon a conquering military commander, signifying unparalleled achievement. This ceremonial procession constituted an extraordinary public spectacle, often spanning several days, featuring a solemn parade of subjugated captives, an opulent exhibition of plundered riches, and intricate dramatizations depicting the newly acquired or resecured territories, all designed to awe and inspire. As an enduring architectural testament to this decisive triumph, the Arch of Titus was subsequently erected in Rome, where it majestically persists to this day. Within its formidable structure, the arch is adorned with meticulously crafted relief sculptures, vividly depicting Roman legionaries bearing away the sacred spoils of war from the Jerusalem temple, prominently featuring the renowned seven-branched menorah, a potent emblem of Jewish faith. Throughout the annals of Jewish history, These poignant visual narratives have functioned as an agonizing mnemonic of the profound spiritual and cultural patrimony that was cruelly wrested away. Yet simultaneously, they have evolved into an enduring emblem of an indomitable spirit, promising eventual restoration and a return to their ancestral lands. Remarkably, the very inscription etched upon the arch, originally intended to laud the subjugation of Judea, has, through the passage of time, paradoxically transformed into an unintended, yet powerful testament to the unyielding resilience and steadfast endurance of the Jewish people. The vast wealth plundered from the sacred temple was subsequently diverted to finance the ambitious construction of the Flavian amphitheater, more commonly known as the Colosseum. This allocation signifies that one of the most iconic and enduring monuments of ancient Rome was quite literally erected from the precious metals, the gold and silver, extracted from the Jewish sanctuary. A palpable historical irony pervades this circumstance. A colossal edifice conceived for the purpose of public spectacles and mass entertainment found its financial genesis in the catastrophic ruination of what was, without question, one of humanity's most hallowed religious edifices. Furthermore, the Colosseum would, in subsequent eras, tragically serve as the arena where numerous Jewish and Christian individuals met their martyrdom, thereby imbuing this already poignant connection with yet another profound stratum of sorrowful symbolism and historical resonance. However, the narrative of conflict and defiance did not conclude with the mere capitulation of Jerusalem. Despite the apparent totality of the Roman triumph, the embers of Jewish resistance within the province were far from extinguished, persisting in pockets of tenacious defiance. A number of formidable strongholds defiantly maintained their autonomy, most notably the precipitous fortress of Masada, which provided sanctuary to a contingent of zealots and their kin. The protracted siege of Masada, which endured until approximately 73 or 74 CE, was destined to be etched into the annals as one of the most celebrated and poignant chapters in the extensive chronicle of Jewish experience. Nonetheless, it remains imperative to acknowledge that our principal historical conduit for this dramatic account is once more Josephus, whose narrative, while invaluable, might be imbued with a degree of embellishment or romantic idealization. As recounted by Josephus, upon the eventual penetration of Masada's formidable defenses by the Roman forces, they discovered a scene of profound desolation. The besieged defenders had collectively chosen to end their lives in a mass act of defiance, rather than face the ignominy of capture and subjugation. It is alleged that Eleazar ben Yair, the charismatic leader of these resolute defenders, delivered a succession of impassioned orations, persuasively arguing to his adherents that a dignified demise was infinitely more desirable than the degradation of enslavement. Irrespective of the precise historical veracity of this particular rendition of events, Masada irrevocably cemented its place as a potent and enduring emblem of Jewish fortitude, embodying a profound commitment to resistance and an unwavering readiness to sacrifice one's life in the pursuit of liberty and deeply held religious principles. The repercussions of the Jewish war reverberated with far greater amplitude than merely within the confines of Judea itself, extending their influence across vast swathes of the Roman dominion. Indeed, Jewish enclaves dispersed across the expansive Roman Empire experienced profound ramifications from the temple's obliteration, both in tangible, practical terms and on a deeply unsettling psychological plane. A particularly galling measure saw the fiscus Judaicus, the annual temple tax that Jews across the diaspora had customarily remitted to sustain the sacred institution in Jerusalem, forcibly reallocated by the Roman authorities. This compulsory levy was now redirected to fund the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome, a supreme affront. This strategic appropriation constituted a calculated and deliberate act of humiliation, effectively compounding the grievous injury of loss with the added indignity of religious subjugation and financial exploitation. Beyond the social and spiritual upheavals, the protracted conflict precipitated substantial economic ramifications throughout the region. Prior to the hostilities, Judea had flourished as a remarkably affluent province, consistently furnishing considerable fiscal contributions to the coffers of the Roman imperial treasury. However, the comprehensive devastation of Jerusalem and the extensive depopulation of vast tracts of the surrounding rural landscape led to a precipitous and severe curtailment of this vital revenue flow. Consequently, the Roman administration found itself compelled to expend substantial resources in the arduous task of reconstruction and the complex process of repopulating the decimated territories. It would foreseeably require several decades for Judea to regain even a semblance of its former economic vitality and productivity that characterized the pre-war era. The demographic repercussions proved to be no less dire, inflicting an equally profound and devastating toll on the populace. While Josephus's assertion of over 1 million fatalities during the conflict is widely considered an almost certain exaggeration, even more circumspect scholarly projections indicate that the indigenous population of Judea experienced a reduction of at least 50%. The aftermath witnessed the wholesale abandonment of countless towns and villages. Extensive agricultural lands lay fallow and unworked, and the intricate social and economic frameworks that had hitherto underpinned and nourished Jewish civilization within the territory were utterly fragmented and irreparably broken. The obliteration of the temple also bore exceptionally profound ramifications for the divergent trajectories and subsequent evolution of both Judaism and nascent Christianity. For the Jewish people, this unprecedented catastrophe necessitated a radical and comprehensive reconceptualization of their religious observances, theological precepts, and collective identity. The burgeoning class of rabbinic scholars, who swiftly rose to prominence as the new spiritual arbiters, were confronted with the monumental task of discerning how to meticulously uphold and transmit Jewish law and cherished traditions in the absence of the central cultic institution that had served as the organizational nexus for millennia. This challenging exigency catalyzed an extraordinary efflorescence of Jewish erudition and intricate legal exegesis, as the sagacious rabbis diligently labored to adapt ancient statutes and ordinances to the drastically altered contemporary circumstances. The Mishnah, recognized as the foundational compendium of rabbinic literature, was systematically compiled in the centuries subsequent to the temple's demise, standing as a monumental testament to this colossal endeavor to safeguard and ingeniously modify the venerable Jewish heritage. Their meticulous scholarly efforts involved painstakingly determining which specific laws pertaining to temple rituals could be judiciously reconfigured for congregational worship in synagogues, which established practices could be seamlessly transposed to the domestic sphere of the Jewish home, and, crucially, which eschatological observances would necessarily remain deferred until the prophesied reconstruction of the temple in the anticipated Messianic era. From the perspective of early Christianity, The devastation of Jerusalem functioned as a pivotal theological inflection point, profoundly reorienting its self-perception and doctrinal framework. Influential early Christian chroniclers, notably the authors of the Gospels, had meticulously documented Jesus' prescient pronouncements regarding the eventual ruination of the temple, a foretelling of great significance. The subsequent, undeniable fulfillment of these prophetic utterances appeared to lend compelling validation to the burgeoning Christian assertions concerning Jesus' inherent divine essence and his unimpeachable prophetic authority, reinforcing their nascent faith. Concurrently, this profound catastrophe that had so grievously afflicted the Jewish homeland served as a powerful catalyst, significantly accelerating the already nascent process of Christianity's eventual disengagement and separation from its foundational Jewish matrix. The imperial Roman perspective concerning the protracted conflict diverged considerably, as might be anticipated, from that of the subjugated populace. From their vantage point, the Jewish war was fundamentally an imperative exercise in preserving the unassailable authority of the Roman Empire, and unequivocally demonstrating that any insurgence against Roman dominion would be met with absolute and uncompromising reprisal. The utter devastation of Jerusalem, therefore, served as a stark, didactic example, a cautionary tale intended for other provinces harboring nascent rebellious sentiments, conveying the unequivocal message: such are the grim consequences when one dares to defy the might of Roman supremacy. However, the Roman authorities also appeared to harbor a degree of perplexity regarding the sheer intensity and unyielding tenacity of Jewish resistance, finding it an anomaly. Their historical experience typically involved encountering peoples who, despite initially fighting ferociously for their autonomy, would ultimately acquiesce to defeat and assimilate into the vast imperial structure. The unyielding Jewish refusal to compromise on deeply ingrained religious principles, their profound readiness to embrace death rather than partake in the mandatory imperial cult observances, and their seemingly intractable preference for self-destruction over cultural assimilation presented a formidable intellectual challenge for Roman administrators to fully comprehend or reconcile with their prevailing worldview. This fundamental lack of mutual understanding and persistent cultural chasm would regrettably continue to define the complex and often fraught relationship between the Roman Empire and its Jewish subjects for many centuries thereafter. The Roman administration, despite its vast experience in imperial governance, never truly deciphered the intricate challenge of ruling a populace whose paramount allegiance was directed towards an unseen, transcendent deity, rather than to the tangible, deified figure of the reigning emperor, a concept alien to their political theology. This enduring ideological friction inevitably precipitated subsequent periods of intense conflict, notably culminating in the formidable Bar Kokhba revolt, which raged from 132 to 135 CE, a rebellion that tragically yielded even more catastrophic and enduring consequences for the indigenous Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. In the immediate wake of the temple's calamitous destruction, the region was plunged into an extensive humanitarian crisis, characterized by a massive displacement of populations and a widespread refugee exodus. Driven from their ancestral lands, Jewish inhabitants embarked upon a desperate flight from Palestine, subsequently establishing and augmenting vibrant diaspora communities across the entire Mediterranean basin. Prominent urban centers such as Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and even the imperial capital of Rome itself witnessed a significant surge in their existing Jewish populations, as these cities became havens for traumatized refugees, bearing harrowing narratives of the unparalleled catastrophe that had engulfed their cherished homeland. Crucially, these displaced individuals carried with them not only the profound burdens of their personal tragedies and collective suffering, but also innovative conceptual frameworks and emergent strategies for how Judaism could potentially endure and creatively adapt its venerable traditions in a dramatically reconfigured world, bereft of its central, sacred temple. This unprecedented refugee influx concomitantly engendered novel frictions and exacerbated pre-existing fault lines within the established Jewish communities already thriving in the diaspora. Long-settled diaspora Jews, many of whom had enjoyed generations of relative tranquility and prosperity under the Pax Romana, suddenly found their collective identity inextricably linked with the very populace who had recently waged a catastrophic and brutal war against the formidable Roman Empire, creating an uncomfortable association. The newly arrived refugees, deeply traumatized by their harrowing experiences and frequently radicalized by the immensity of their losses, occasionally found themselves in ideological contention with their diaspora brethren, whom they sometimes perceived as excessively compliant or overly accommodating to the dictates of Roman imperial authority. These burgeoning social strains were further compounded and intensified by significant economic pressures that arose from the changed circumstances. The sudden arrival of a substantial number of displaced persons exerted considerable strain upon the finite resources of the existing diaspora communities, simultaneously introducing a large cohort of skilled yet desperate laborers who, out of sheer necessity, were prepared to accept exceptionally low wages. This economic dynamic inevitably fostered resentment among the long-established residents and regrettably contributed to a measurable degree of social instability and unrest within several prominent urban centers across the empire. The Roman government's administrative response to these escalating internal tensions, while characteristically pragmatic in its immediate aims, frequently proved to be profoundly counterproductive in its long-term effects. In a move to recoup their expenses, they levied punitive additional taxes upon Jewish communities throughout the empire, ostensibly to defray the substantial costs incurred during the war and to finance the enduring military occupation of Palestine. Furthermore, imperial edicts introduced a range of restrictive measures targeting specific Jewish religious practices, especially those rites or customs that Roman authorities perceived as harboring potential political undertones or subversive implications. The cumulative outcome of these policies was a regrettable intensification, rather than alleviation, of Jewish estrangement and alienation from the overarching authority of Roman imperial governance, fostering deeper resentment. Among the most profound and enduring ramifications stemming from the temple's devastation was a fundamental reorientation in Jewish collective attitudes towards the exercise of political power and the viability of military resistance. The abject and catastrophic failure of the Great Revolt compelled a significant segment of the Jewish populace to arrive at the sobering conclusion that direct armed confrontation with the formidable Roman Empire was utterly futile, and that the long-term prospects for survival hinged upon strategic accommodation and adaptive resilience, rather than continued belligerence. This pivotal attitudinal transformation found its clearest manifestation in the emergent paradigm of Rabbinic Judaism, a spiritual and intellectual movement that accorded paramount importance to intensive Torah study, devout prayer, and exemplary ethical conduct. consciously de-emphasizing overt political activism or direct military engagement. The esteemed rabbis propagated the theological interpretation that the temple's tragic destruction served as a divine chastisement for collective Jewish transgressions, particularly citing the egregious sin of sinat chinam, or baseless hatred and internecine strife among various Jewish factions. The efficacious remedy, they passionately contended, lay not in renewed military defiance, but rather in a profound program of moral rectitude and spiritual regeneration, a turning inward. However, it is crucial to underscore that this ideological shift did not signify a universal or passive acceptance of Roman hegemony by all Jewish communities. Indeed, clandestine resistance movements persisted, and the subsequent eruption of the Bar Kokhba revolt unequivocally demonstrated that the deeply ingrained spirit of rebellion and an unyielding yearning for independence were far from extinguished within the Jewish psyche. Nevertheless, the prevailing currents of mainstream Jewish intellectual and spiritual thought definitively gravitated away from apocalyptic expectations of immediate divine intervention and instead embraced a more measured, patient, and enduring strategy centered on cultural preservation and sustained religious survival amidst a challenging geopolitical landscape. The obliteration of the temple bore profound repercussions for established Jewish messianic beliefs. This sacred edifice had been inextricably interwoven with profound anticipations of a forthcoming Messiah, a figure prophesied to reestablish the sovereign autonomy of the Jewish people and inaugurate an epoch of universal tranquility and abundant well-being. Consequently, when the temple met its demise, these deeply held expectations demanded rigorous re-examination and creative re-articulation. A segment of the Jewish populace concluded that the Messiah's advent had been deferred owing to collective transgressions, asserting that a renewed commitment to penitence and virtuous conduct was indispensable for accelerating his arrival. Conversely, other groups meticulously crafted intricate theological frameworks to elucidate why the Almighty had permitted such an unprecedented calamity to unfold. Meanwhile, nascent Christian communities, particularly, contended that the long-awaited Anointed One had already manifested in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and that the temple's destruction constituted an integral component of divine providence to inaugurate an entirely new spiritual compact. The financial ramifications of the temple's devastation reached extensively beyond the geographical confines of Palestine. This revered sanctuary had served as the epicenter of an expansive commercial web that profoundly interlinked Jewish diaspora communities across the entire Mediterranean basin. The annual collection of the temple tax, the steady influx of pilgrims, the burgeoning tourism industry, and the vibrant trade in ritual objects had together amassed immense riches and sustained countless livelihoods. When this intricate financial apparatus disintegrated, its dire repercussions reverberated from the Iberian Peninsula to the Mesopotamian plains. Jewish merchants, whose enterprises were intrinsically tied to the sacred commerce of the temple, were compelled to seek alternative avenues for sustenance and profit. Similarly, craftsmen whose artisanal expertise focused on crafting sacred artifacts for liturgical purposes had to reorient their talents towards profane commercial demands. The holistic economic infrastructure, which had flourished around the temple, evaporated virtually instantaneously. The Roman authorities endeavored to appropriate a segment of this economic vitality by diverting the traditional temple tax towards the coffers of Roman pagan cults. However, this initiative met with limited efficacy. A substantial portion of the capital that once flowed into Jerusalem was irrecoverably withdrawn from the broader Roman fiscal system, as Jewish adherents largely curtailed their customary religious donations rather than subsidize the worship of polytheistic deities. The cultural impact of the temple's destruction was similarly momentous. The sacred precinct had been more than merely a religious institution. It functioned as a vibrant nexus of Jewish intellectual inquiry and cultural expression. The invaluable temple library, housing venerable scrolls and invaluable documents spanning many centuries, succumbed entirely to the conflagration. The painstaking accumulation of generations of scholarly endeavor, established legal precedents, and irreplaceable historical chronicles ascended in plumes of smoke, along with the edifice itself. This catastrophic obliteration of written materials rendered the meticulous preservation of oral tradition an even more critically vital imperative for the enduring continuity of Jewish identity. The sages and scholars who ascended to prominence as the nascent religious authorities were compelled to depend profoundly upon mnemonic recall and verbal conveyance to safeguard the extensive corpus of Jewish jurisprudence, established societal norms, and intricate exegetical understanding, which had heretofore been augmented and codified by textual documentation. This exigency precipitated the evolution of highly refined methodologies for the precise retention and faithful dissemination of substantial intellectual content across successive epochs. Moreover, the devastation signaled the definitive cessation of the hereditary priesthood as a viable operational institution. The priests, or Kohanim, had historically drawn their spiritual legitimacy and their economic sustenance directly from their indispensable participation in the sacred temple rites. Deprived of the temple, their primary vocational purpose vanished, rendering them largely bereft of their traditional occupation. Although they nonetheless preserved specific ritualistic duties and a distinguished social standing within Jewish communities, the tangible direction of Jewish spiritual existence transitioned unequivocally to the rabbis, whose legitimacy stemmed from profound scholarly attainment rather than ancestral lineage. This metamorphosis from a lineage-based priestly caste to an erudite rabbinical order represented arguably among the most transformative institutional reconfigurations within the annals of Jewish history. It fundamentally signified that spiritual governance became, at least conceptually, more egalitarian and founded upon individual merit. Any individual exhibiting ample scholarly proficiency and profound devotion could, in principle, aspire to rabbinic ordination, irrespective of their familial origins. This seminal alteration would undeniably have far-reaching ramifications for the trajectory of Jewish intellectual and cultural evolution throughout subsequent centuries. The profound psychological anguish engendered by the temple's obliteration is virtually immeasurable. For a multitude of Jewish adherents, this calamity represented not merely a tactical military setback, but a cataclysmic event of cosmic proportions. The temple had long stood as the tangible emblem of the divine presence manifest within the earthly realm, the sacred locus where the celestial and terrestrial spheres converged. Its utter ruination, therefore, provoked existential interrogations concerning the Almighty's enduring bond with the Jewish nation and his fidelity to the sacred covenant. Various Jewish factions formulated distinct theological paradigms in response to this profound crisis. Some groups concluded that the Almighty was meting out chastisement upon the Jewish populace for their collective transgressions, asserting that sincere penitence was indispensable for reinstating divine approbation. Conversely, others posited that the destruction constituted an integral component of an overarching divine design destined to culminate in ultimate deliverance and salvation. Yet a third perspective speculated whether the Almighty truly maintained absolute superintendence over historical occurrences, or if malevolent entities had momentarily asserted dominance over the temporal realm. These theological debates, crucially, transcended the realm of mere theoretical discourse. They carried profound, tangible consequences for the lived experiences of Jewish individuals and their engagement with the surrounding non-Jewish societies. Should they, for instance, retreat into isolation from secular societal structures, dedicating themselves exclusively to religious adherence? Or should they endeavor to integrate fully into the prevailing Greco-Roman cultural milieu? Alternatively, was it incumbent upon them to mobilize for sustained armed opposition against the Roman Imperium? The resolutions to these pivotal inquiries would indelibly sculpt the subsequent evolution of Jewish faith and practice. The destruction of Jerusalem also bore momentous ramifications for nascent Christianity, which at that juncture largely constituted a Jewish sectarian movement. Many early Christians interpreted the temple's destruction as the manifest realization of Jesus' eschatological pronouncements and as unequivocal divine corroboration of their conviction that Jesus was indeed the Anointed One. The calamity that had afflicted the non-Christian Jewish population appeared to unequivocally affirm that the Almighty had, in fact, forged a novel spiritual compact through Christ. Concurrently, Jerusalem's devastation compelled Christian adherents to meticulously reevaluate their intrinsic connection to Mosaic law and ancestral Jewish customs. With the temple's obliteration and the cessation of the sacrificial cult, what implications did this hold for Christian adherence to Jewish legal precepts? Should Christians persist in observing the Sabbath, dietary regulations, and other specific Jewish customs? Or did the temple's demise signify that such observances were henceforth rendered superfluous? Different Christian communities responded to these inquiries in diverse manners, yet the prevailing trajectory gravitated towards a gradual disengagement from Jewish practices and the concomitant genesis of uniquely Christian rites and organizational structures. The destruction of Jerusalem significantly expedited this evolutionary trajectory by dismantling the tangible and organizational nucleus of Jewish Christianity. The Roman administration governing post-war Palestine confronted formidable obstacles. The territory had been utterly ravaged by 4 protracted years of intense military conflict, leaving a substantial portion of its foundational infrastructure in ruins. Urban centers and rural settlements alike were reduced to rubble. Cultivated agricultural tracts had been forsaken, and the populace tragically decimated by the ravages of war, epidemic illnesses, and forced relocation. In response, the Romans implemented a dual strategy encompassing stringent military occupation and judicious economic inducements, meticulously crafted to reinstate regional stability and foster renewed productivity. They erected enduring legionary garrisons throughout the territory and facilitated the influx of settlers from various imperial domains to revitalize desolate locales. Furthermore, they allocated considerable resources towards the reconstruction of vital infrastructure, embarking on the construction of novel thoroughfares, elaborate aqueduct systems, and essential public edifices. Nevertheless, These painstaking efforts were exacerbated by persistent friction with the indigenous Jewish populace that had endured the conflict. Many Jews perceived the Roman rehabilitation endeavors as a deliberate stratagem to obliterate their distinct Jewish identity and supplant it with pervasive Greco-Roman cultural norms. The erection of pagan shrines and the transplantation of non-Jewish settlers were, therefore, interpreted as calculated affronts, rather than pragmatic imperatives for regional recovery. The Romans, for their part, were exasperated by what they perceived as Jewish recalcitrance and an enduring defiance of imperial sovereignty. They had, after all, poured substantial capital into the revitalization of the ravaged province. Yet a significant segment of the Jewish population persisted in their animosity towards Roman governance and harbored a profound longing for their forfeited autonomy. This profound reciprocal misunderstanding would, regrettably, continue to vitiate Roman-Jewish relations for many subsequent generations. The diaspora Jewish communities, in the wake of the temple's devastating loss, grappled with a unique constellation of adversities. They were compelled to integrate substantial contingents of displaced persons, concurrently contending with heightened mistrust and antagonism from their Gentile counterparts. The perceived complicity of Jews in the insurrection against Rome rendered them politically dubious across the vast expanse of the empire. Many diaspora communities responded to this precarious situation by underscoring their unwavering fealty to Rome and their inherently pacifistic dispositions. They asserted vehemently that the insurgents in Palestine constituted radical elements who did not accurately embody prevalent Jewish sentiments. Furthermore, they adduced evidence of their protracted history of harmonious cohabitation with their Gentile neighbors and their significant contributions to regional economies and cultural tapestries. Yet, these overtures of appeasement achieved only limited traction. The entrenched perception of Jews as an inherently rebellious and culturally intractable populace had been dramatically solidified by the seismic occurrences in Palestine, and it would require several generations for this unfavorable reputation to dissipate. In the interim, Jewish communities throughout the empire had to meticulously chart a course between preserving their distinct religious heritage and unequivocally affirming their political allegiance. The evolution of rabbinic Judaism during the decades succeeding the temple's ruination stands as an extraordinary testament to religious and intellectual resilience and adaptation. The rabbis were compelled to fundamentally re-envision and reconstruct Judaism for an existence devoid of its central sanctuary, forging novel institutions, devising innovative practices, and establishing fresh paradigms of authority capable of safeguarding Jewish identity and ensuring its enduring continuity amidst profoundly altered realities. This transformative process involved vigorous discourse and divergent opinions regarding pivotal tenets of Jewish jurisprudence and religious observance. Such questions included: which sacred ordinances traditionally linked to the temple could be reinterpreted for modified observance, and which were to be temporarily suspended pending the sanctuary's restoration. In the absence of the centralized authority previously vested in the temple hierarchy, by what organizational principles should Jewish communities now govern themselves? Furthermore, what constituted the appropriate interface between divine Jewish law and the secular jurisprudence of the Roman Empire? To address these complex inquiries, the rabbis pioneered sophisticated methodologies encompassing meticulous legal exegesis, judicious reliance upon established precedents, and collaborative democratic deliberation among highly qualified scholars. These groundbreaking methods would subsequently become the cornerstone of Jewish legal erudition for forthcoming centuries, and would exert a discernible influence upon the evolution of legal frameworks, extending well beyond the confines of the Jewish community itself. The profound transformations that reshaped Jewish life extended far beyond the immediate confines of the Jewish community itself. One of the most pivotal shifts in the post-temple era was the ascendancy of the synagogue as the linchpin of communal and spiritual existence for Jews. While these houses of assembly had a foundational presence in scattered communities prior to the temple's destruction, their function had been largely complementary rather than primary substitutes for the elaborate temple worship. However, in the wake of 70 CE, synagogues swiftly became the foremost settings for Jewish religious observance. Their utility expanded beyond mere venues for devotional supplications and scholarly inquiry. They also served as vibrant community hubs for social gatherings, dedicated educational institutions for all ages, and authoritative judicial forums for resolving disputes. The synagogue service itself was meticulously reconfigured to integrate components that had previously been integral to temple worship, incorporating prayers that echoed the ancient daily sacrificial rites and scriptural recitations of the sacred Torah. Assuming the ceremonial functions once performed by the priesthood, this profound transformation of the synagogue from a supplementary to a central institution necessitated immense ingenuity and a robust theological framework. The erudite rabbis were tasked with articulating precisely how prayer could spiritually substitute for sacrifice, how diligent study could replace the arduous pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and how dispersed local communities could maintain their profound connection to the divine without the direct mediation of the venerable temple priesthood. Concurrently, the Jewish home significantly elevated its spiritual prominence as a vital center of religious life. Rituals and customs, once intrinsically linked to the grand temple complex, were skillfully recontextualized for intimate domestic celebration. The Sabbath meal, for instance, evolved into a symbolic parallel to the temple sacrifice, complete with special blessings, prayers, and specific rituals that imbued it with sacred meaning. Similarly, the Passover Seder was thoughtfully redesigned to commemorate not only the foundational exodus from Egypt, but also to integrate the poignant memory of the temple's destruction and to articulate the fervent hope for its eventual restoration. This profound domestication of Jewish religious practice bore far-reaching ramifications for the position of women within the fabric of Jewish spiritual existence. While women had been predominantly sidelined from direct participation in the temple's sacerdotal duties, they now assumed pivotal responsibilities in upholding and perpetuating Jewish religious adherence within the household domain. The destruction of the temple thus unintentionally amplified the significance of women in safeguarding and passing down the rich tapestry of Jewish heritage across generations. The entire educational system also underwent a fundamental overhaul. The Venerable Temple had served as an eminent nucleus of Jewish erudition, hosting dedicated academies within its precincts where scholars, particularly young men, delved deeply into the sacred texts of the Torah and the intricate tenets of Jewish jurisprudence. With the temple gone, innovative educational frameworks became imperative for the conservation and dissemination of profound Jewish wisdom. Erudite rabbis pioneered the establishment of specialized yeshivot, or advanced academies, where students could immerse themselves in Jewish law, biblical interpretation, ethical teachings, and other subjects crucial for emerging religious leadership. These yeshivot swiftly became the fresh epicenters of Jewish scholarly pursuit, nurturing the sagacious minds destined to steer Jewish congregations through the formidable exigencies of existence beneath the Roman imperial yoke. The pedagogical focus of these yeshivot was inherently distinct from what had been taught in the temple schools. A significantly greater accentuation was placed upon intricate legalistic argumentation and meticulous textual exegesis, as the rabbis were compelled to forge novel interpretations and practical applications of time-honored statutes to address the evolving realities of their contemporary environment. There was also a heightened dedication to safeguarding the rich repository of oral traditions, given that a substantial volume of invaluable written scholarship had tragically vanished in the destruction of Jerusalem. The financial sustenance of Jewish communities underwent a compulsory reorientation as well. The temple had been more than merely a sacred edifice. It was also a colossal economic engine, employing thousands of people and generating enormous wealth through the temple tax, the influx of pilgrims, tourism, and a myriad of related commercial activities. With this vital economic mechanism gone, Jewish communities were compelled to seek alternative avenues for both individual sustenance and collective financial endowment. A considerable number of Jewish individuals pivoted towards mercantile endeavors and commercial ventures, leveraging existing intricate networks cultivated across the dispersed diaspora communities. Jewish traders distinguished themselves as particularly influential figures in the realm of trans-regional commerce, harnessing their extensive kinship and communal ties with Jewish settlements spanning the entire Mediterranean basin to seamlessly expedite intricate commercial dealings. This pronounced economic acumen and specialization would subsequently emerge as an indelible hallmark of Jewish life in the diaspora. The disappearance of the centralized financial reservoir, which had hitherto underwritten and sustained Jewish communal undertakings across the expanse of the ancient world, created a significant void. Individual local congregations were compelled to cultivate a heightened degree of fiscal autonomy, innovating and establishing independent mechanisms for generating revenue to support their burgeoning synagogues, educational institutions, and various philanthropic endeavors. This necessity consequently spurred the evolution of increasingly intricate frameworks for communal administration and sagacious fiscal stewardship. The Roman government's decision to divert the sacred temple tax towards the coffers of Roman pagan cults and imperial deities was exceptionally vexing and deeply offensive to Jews throughout the empire. This tax, notoriously known as the fiscus Judaicus, was levied universally upon all individuals of Jewish heritage, irrespective of their geographical domicile within the vast empire, serving as a perpetual emblem of their subordinated and vanquished condition. The fact that the very funds designated for their sacred observances were being channeled into the maintenance of idolatrous practices thus compounded the indignity. Certain Jewish individuals attempted to circumvent this onerous impost by assiduously obscuring their religious affiliation. Yet such endeavors proved inherently perilous and frequently futile. Roman fiscal agents developed considerable acumen in discerning and identifying individuals of Jewish descent, and the punitive repercussions for fiscal delinquency were unsparingly harsh. The tax thus emerged as an additional potent catalyst impelling Jewish populations either towards cultural absorption within Roman society or towards migration to territories situated beyond the direct dominion of the Roman Imperium. The destruction of the temple also bore profound repercussions for the evolving psychological and spiritual disposition of the Jewish people. The valiant tenacity and unyielding defiance exhibited by the temple's last defenders, who resolutely embraced martyrdom over capitulation, forged an enduring paradigm for subsequent epochs of Jewish communities confronting relentless religious oppression. This unwavering resolve to sacrifice life itself, rather than relinquish core religious tenets, crystallized into a fundamental and distinguishing hallmark of Jewish selfhood. This attitude was further reinforced by vivid narratives of martyrs from the period of the revolt, such as the revered Rabbi Akiva, who was brutally tortured to death by the Romans for steadfastly continuing to teach Torah in defiance of imperial edicts. Such narratives functioned dually, acting both as potent wellsprings of spiritual fervor and as stark admonitions concerning the dire consequences inherent in challenging the formidable authority of Rome. The burgeoning trajectory of Jewish mystical traditions was similarly shaped and profoundly impacted by the searing trauma of the temple's destruction. Some Jewish thinkers gravitated towards recondite philosophical and theological conjectures concerning the ineffable essence of the divine and the intricate architecture of the cosmos, seeking a framework to comprehend the monumental catastrophe that had befallen their people. While these mystical traditions would eventually develop into the complex system known as Kabbalah over many centuries, the era immediately succeeding the temple's ruin witnessed the proliferation of diverse genres of Jewish apocalyptic writings. These works endeavored to elucidate the cataclysmic destruction through the lens of an overarching cosmic struggle between benevolent and malevolent forces, often prophesying an imminent cessation of the prevailing era of affliction, to be heralded by direct divine intercession and the glorious reinstatement of Jewish sovereignty. Although these fervent prognostications ultimately remained unfulfilled, the literary corpus they generated nonetheless cemented its place as a significant component of Jewish spiritual and cultural heritage. The relationship between Jewish communities and early Christian adherents became progressively intricate and fraught with nuanced divergences in the aftermath of the temple's destruction. Both nascent communities grappled fervently with the monumental calamity, striving to decipher its profound implications for their respective theological interpretations of divine providence and humanity's ultimate destiny. Adherents of the burgeoning Christian faith largely construed the temple's demise as a definitive corroboration of their conviction regarding Jesus' messianic status and the establishment of a novel covenant by the Almighty. Jewish communities, understandably, repudiated this particular exegesis, instead formulating distinct theological rationales to account for the catastrophic events that had transpired. These divergent and often irreconcilable hermeneutical perspectives inevitably fomented escalated antagonism. Christian polemicists occasionally asserted that the temple's ruination served as irrefutable evidence of God's abandonment of his ancient covenant people, while Jewish scholars and communal leaders, conversely, steadfastly contended that the destruction represented a transient divine chastisement, destined to be succeeded by an ultimate era of spiritual renewal and national liberation. Such fundamental theological schisms exerted tangible practical consequences upon the evolving rapport between Jewish and Christian congregations across the vast expanse of the Roman Imperium. The Roman government's attitude toward both Jews and Christians was rendered more intricate and multifaceted by the calamitous fall of Jerusalem. On the one hand, the decisive subjugation of the Jewish insurrection served as an undeniable testament to the unparalleled might of Roman military prowess and underscored the utter futility of challenging imperial dominion. Conversely, the fervent zeal of Jewish resistance, deeply rooted in profound religious convictions, instilled a palpable apprehension among Roman administrators regarding other nascent groups exhibiting comparable characteristics. The nascent Christian adherents, sharing numerous doctrinal tenets and customary practices with their Jewish counterparts, occasionally found themselves ensnared in a web of suspicion and subsequently endured periods of persecution, largely due to their perceived affiliation with the recently rebellious province of Judea. The undeniable geographical genesis of Christianity within Palestine and the historical reality of its founder's execution under Roman decree rendered Christians politically dubious in the estimation of certain Roman officials. The destruction of Jerusalem also held significant ramifications for the ongoing evolution of Christian doctrinal principles and liturgical observances. The abrupt cessation of the venerable temple sacrificial system provoked profound theological inquiries concerning the ultimate significance of Christ's atoning sacrifice and its precise relationship to established Jewish ceremonial practices. Christian exegetes were therefore compelled to articulate a coherent explanation elucidating why the crucifixion of Jesus had rendered the ancient temple sacrifices obsolete, and how their nascent forms of Christian adoration connected with or diverged from the Jewish rituals that had historically revolved around the sacred temple. The demographic and spiritual epicenter of Christianity concurrently commenced a gradual migration away from its Palestinian origins, gravitating towards other influential regions within the expansive Roman Empire, with the imperial capital of Rome emerging as a preeminent hub. With Jerusalem lying in desolation and its indigenous Jewish Christian community dispersed, the mantle of leadership within the burgeoning Christian movement progressively transitioned to Gentile converts, who inherently possessed distinct viewpoints concerning the intricate theological and practical nexus between Christianity and Judaism. Following the devastating obliteration of the temple, the safeguarding of Jewish scriptures and ancestral customs emerged as an exceedingly pressing imperative. A multitude of invaluable documents had tragically succumbed to the conflagration, presenting a palpable peril that fundamental components of Jewish jurisprudence and heritage could vanish irrevocably if not swiftly documented and secured for posterity. Consequently, the esteemed rabbinic authorities initiated an extensive endeavor, meticulously gathering, systematically arranging, and diligently inscribing the rich oral sagas and interpretations that had been faithfully transmitted across countless generations of Jewish erudites. This monumental undertaking would ultimately culminate in the authoritative codification of the Mishnah, representing the seminal literary achievement of rabbinic scholarship. Nevertheless, this intricate process spanned multiple centuries and necessitated the collaborative efforts of learned individuals spanning the entire global Jewish community. Beyond the mere conservation of established customs, the formidable task also encompassed their skillful modification to suit novel environments. Legal precepts, originally formulated for a societal framework intrinsically tied to the temple's central role, demanded profound reinterpretation to serve the diverse communities dispersed across the diaspora. Similarly, religious observances predicated upon the presence of an autonomous Jewish state required significant alteration to accommodate existence under external governance. This intricate procedure of adjustment and scholarly re-evaluation necessitated immense intellectual ingenuity and profound theological acumen. The venerable rabbis were tasked with harmonizing reverence for venerable heritage with the pragmatic imperatives of current existence. Their mission was to uphold the fundamental essence of Judaism while simultaneously fostering the adaptive capacity crucial for its enduring survival in a drastically transformed global landscape. Furthermore, the societal organization within Jewish communities experienced profound transformations during the era subsequent to the temple's destruction. The ancestral priesthood, once occupying the apex of the social stratum, witnessed a substantial erosion of its practical responsibilities and jurisdictional power, largely due to the absence of the temple itself. A distinct form of spiritual governance emerged, vested in rabbis whose legitimacy stemmed from their profound erudition and scholarly attainments, rather than from lineage or birthright. This pivotal transition towards a more merit-based framework for religious leadership exerted a notable democratizing influence upon Jewish communal life. Theoretically, any individual who exhibited ample scholarly proficiency and devoutness could ascend to a position of spiritual guidance, irrespective of their familial origins. Realistically, however, the opportunities for acquiring education and the requisite leisure for rigorous academic pursuits remained constrained by prevailing economic disparities and societal circumstances. The demolition of the temple likewise impacted the standing of various Jewish enclaves dispersed across the globe. Prior to this event, all Jewish congregations had invariably regarded Jerusalem as the paramount axis of their spiritual and cultural existence. With the loss of Jerusalem, disparate communities were compelled to cultivate more self-governing structures for their administration and leadership. Certain diaspora settlements, notably those situated in Babylonia, commenced to affirm a heightened degree of autonomy from the established Palestinian Jewish leadership. They proceeded to establish their distinct academies, formulate their unique exegesis of Jewish jurisprudence, and institute their own modalities of communal oversight. This profound diffusion of Jewish authority would wield enduring ramifications for the subsequent evolution of Jewish civilization and religious observance. The financial repercussions stemming from the temple's obliteration persisted in echoing across the Jewish globe for successive generations. The cessation of the vital pilgrimage traffic adversely impacted not solely Jerusalem itself, but equally numerous communities situated along the established routes, which had historically furnished various provisions and accommodations to wayfarers. Jewish traders, whose enterprises had formerly focused on temple-associated commerce, were compelled to identify novel marketplaces and diversify their offerings with new commodities. Moreover, the diversion of the customary temple levy towards Roman religious establishments constituted a substantial transference of monetary assets from Jewish coffers into Roman possession. This particular impost had historically underpinned not only the sanctuary itself, but also a broad spectrum of Jewish scholastic and philanthropic endeavors. Its forfeiture necessitated that Jewish communities devise alternative revenue streams to sustain these indispensable provisions. In response to these formidable economic adversities, numerous Jewish communities ingeniously forged innovative models of financial collaboration and reciprocal assistance. They instituted benevolent loan initiatives to empower their constituents in launching nascent commercial ventures, conceived sophisticated insurance mechanisms to safeguard against potential mercantile setbacks, and cultivated intricate webs of commercial alliances that extended their reach across the entire Mediterranean basin. The burgeoning cultural ingenuity that materialized from the profound upheaval of the temple's demolition was truly extraordinary. Across the scattered Jewish communities of the diaspora, novel modalities of spiritual articulation, fresh literary categories, and innovative strategies for preserving their distinct identity in the midst of powerful assimilationist currents took root. Fresh liturgical compositions were crafted to memorialize the ruined sanctuary and articulate fervent aspirations for its eventual reconstruction. The sacred practice of Torah recitation was enriched with intricate frameworks of elucidation and scholarly exegesis. Furthermore, the roles of melodic expression and poetic verse gained amplified significance within the tapestry of Jewish religious observance. Congregational synagogues were necessarily reconfigured to fulfill ceremonial and communal roles that had formerly been exclusively performed within the temple's precincts. Jewish artisans, displaying remarkable inventiveness, conceived novel symbolic lexicons capable of articulating Jewish distinctiveness without dependency on the iconic visual motifs of the temple. The renowned synagogue mosaics unearthed from this epoch vividly illustrate the ingenious manner in which Jewish communities assimilated Hellenistic and Roman artistic conventions to convey uniquely Jewish narratives and spiritual concepts. The rabbinic sages meticulously constructed intricate frameworks of legal ratiocination, adept at navigating unprecedented scenarios while simultaneously upholding an unbroken continuum with venerable tradition, analogical principles, and established precedents. A profound intellectual legacy that would, in time, exert influence upon jurisprudential systems extending far beyond the confines of the Jewish community. They pioneered methodologies for extrapolating novel statutes from scriptural narratives, for arbitrating disagreements between divergent legal lineages, and for tailoring archaic ordinances to align with modern exigencies. Moreover, the rabbis were compelled to devise fresh paradigms for communal administration, innovative protocols for ecclesiastical divorce and matrimony, and refined approaches to commercial jurisprudence, all designed to operate effectively within the overarching structure of Roman legal dominion. While Jewish communities were largely permitted to regulate their internal matters in accordance with their ancestral customs, they simultaneously remained bound by the dictates of Roman civil and criminal statutes. The rabbinic leaders were thus faced with the delicate imperative of artfully maneuvering between these two distinct legal frameworks, diligently ensuring that Jewish observances preserved their intrinsic integrity while assiduously precluding any friction with the prevailing Roman imperial authority. The profound psychological and spiritual facets of recuperation following the temple's devastation held equivalent significance to the tangible and structural transformations. Jewish communities were compelled to unearth methods for sustaining optimism and purpose when confronted by what appeared to be an insurmountable calamity. The emergence of novel expressions of Jewish spiritual practice proved indispensable to this intricate healing journey. Supplication ascended to a more pivotal position within Jewish religious existence, manifest in intricate liturgical rites that articulated both profound lamentation for what had vanished and fervent anticipation for ultimate renewal. Concurrently, the rigorous study of Torah was sanctified, rising to a form of devotion capable of supplanting the ancient temple sacrifices. The profound notion of dispersion, or galut, ascended to become a foundational organizing tenet within Jewish philosophical inquiry and communal self-perception. Jewish people progressively interpreted their contemporary predicament not as an irreversible vanquishment, but rather as a transient uprooting, destined to be succeeded by an eventual homecoming and rejuvenation. This particular comprehension furnished a robust conceptual framework for safeguarding Jewish distinctiveness and fostering enduring optimism, even amidst the most arduous of conditions. Intimately connected to this theme of exile was the burgeoning cultivation of messianic aspirations. The deeply held conviction that the divine would, in due course, dispatch a Messiah to reinstate Jewish sovereignty and reconstruct the sacred temple offered both solace and impetus to communities striving valiantly to preserve their distinct character beneath the yoke of alien governance. These potent anticipations occasionally ignited into fervent messianic insurrections, some of which regrettably culminated in profoundly sorrowful outcomes. The function of remembrance within post-temple Judaism assumed an exceptionally paramount significance. Given the physical absence of the sanctuary, its essence necessitated retention within collective memory and diligent conveyance to subsequent generations via narratives, supplications, and ceremonial observances. The traditional Passover Seder liturgy, for instance, underwent modifications to incorporate a solemn remembrance of the temple's demise, alongside the joyous celebration of the exodus from Egyptian bondage. This pronounced emphasis on recollection bore profound consequences for Jewish civilization and self-perception. In a very real sense, Jewish people evolved into a community intrinsically shaped by their recollections of the temple, of past splendors, of sacred pledges, and of the unwavering hope for ultimate renewal. This shared historical consciousness served as both a wellspring of resilience and a point of susceptibility, affording both a robust identity and an unbroken continuity, yet simultaneously positioning Jews as perennial distinct entities within the diverse societies they inhabited. The expansion of Jewish pedagogical systems during the post-temple epoch proved utterly vital for the successful conveyance of this intricate cultural patrimony. The rabbinical authorities founded academies not solely for the rigorous preparation of spiritual guides, but also for the comprehensive instruction of the wider Jewish populace in the fundamentals of Jewish jurisprudence, historical narratives, and established customs. These scholarly establishments were obligated to fulfill a multiplicity of roles. They meticulously safeguarded and disseminated venerable traditions, skillfully adjusted those traditions to align with contemporary realities, and furnished the intellectual instruments essential for Jewish communities to uphold their distinct identity within an often unwelcoming global environment. The profound accentuation on literacy and scholarly pursuit that distinguished these schools would, in time, evolve into one of the quintessential hallmarks of Jewish civilization. The intricate dynamic between Jewish enclaves and their Gentile counterparts grew markedly more convoluted in the wake of the temple's demolition. The perceived nexus between Jewish people and insurgents against Rome rendered them politically dubious, whilst their distinctive religious observances and societal conventions perpetually distinguished them from the prevailing Greco-Roman cultural milieu. Certain Jewish communities addressed these difficulties by underscoring their unwavering allegiance to the Roman Empire and highlighting their beneficial contributions to local society. They actively engaged in municipal affairs, provided resources for communal infrastructure projects, and endeavored to illustrate their worth as integral constituents of their immediate communities, notwithstanding their divergent spiritual convictions. Despite their differing religious convictions, various Jewish communities chose a more isolationist approach, deliberately limiting their interactions with non-Jews and concentrating on preserving the sanctity of their spiritual and cultural heritage. This method offered enhanced safeguards for Jewish identity, yet it simultaneously heightened the danger of persecution and rendered economic subsistence more challenging. Most Jewish communities likely embraced a hybrid of these strategies, engaging with the broader populace when essential, while steadfastly upholding their distinct religious and cultural customs. This delicate balancing act demanded considerable adroitness and frequently entailed agonizing compromises between spiritual ideals and pragmatic necessities. The emergence of Jewish literary works in the era following the temple's destruction profoundly mirrored the community's arduous endeavor to reconcile with the calamitous event and its far-reaching consequences. Novel literary forms materialized, encompassing intricate lamentations for the annihilated sanctuary, prophetic visions of an eventual restoration, and elaborate legal treatises designed to safeguard and adapt ancient customs. The historical chronicles of this epoch, exemplified by the scholarly compositions of Josephus, sought to elucidate the origins of the catastrophe and to perpetually honor the memory of what had been irrevocably forfeited. These profound works functioned both as invaluable historical records and as profound theological declarations concerning the profound meaning of Jewish suffering and the hopeful prospects for ultimate redemption. Poetry and liturgical compositions assumed especially paramount roles as channels of Jewish expression throughout this era. The synagogue worship incorporated meticulously crafted poetic pieces that articulated the complete spectrum of Jewish sentiments. Profound sorrow for what had been lost, fervent indignation at the injustices endured, unwavering hope for an eventual restoration, and steadfast faith in the ultimate divine justice. The pervasive influence of Greco-Roman civilization on Jewish intellectual pursuits became notably more pronounced in the post-temple era. With the sacred edifice gone and Jewish enclaves dispersed across the vast Mediterranean expanse, Jewish intellectuals were compelled to engage more directly with the philosophical and cultural paradigms of their neighboring societies. This profound engagement was not merely a superficial act of assimilation. Jewish luminaries meticulously crafted sophisticated methodologies for seamlessly integrating Greek philosophical concepts into established Jewish theological frameworks. They skillfully employed Greek logical principles to meticulously analyze Jewish legal traditions, utilized Greek rhetorical techniques to artfully interpret biblical texts, and leveraged Greek philosophical categories to comprehensively elucidate Jewish tenets regarding the Almighty and the cosmic order. This intricate intellectual amalgamation was certainly not devoid of contention. Some Jewish individuals expressed profound apprehension that an excessive immersion in Greek culture would inevitably precipitate the erosion of Jewish identity and the abandonment of time-honored beliefs and practices. Conversely, others vehemently contended that such engagement was indispensable for Jewish survival within a thoroughly Hellenized global landscape, and that Jewish truth could only be fortified through an open and robust dialogue with alternative intellectual traditions. The genesis of Jewish mystical traditions was, in part, a profound reaction to the profound trauma of the temple's obliteration and the inherent difficulties of living in forced exile. Some Jewish individuals turned to recondite speculation regarding the very essence of God, the intricate architecture of the cosmos, and the concealed meanings embedded within biblical texts as a profound means of discovering purpose and cultivating hope amidst their challenging circumstances. These burgeoning mystical traditions frequently centered on vivid visions of the divine throne room, elaborate and intricate descriptions of celestial hierarchies, and complex, multi-layered interpretations of biblical narratives that unveiled deeper, hidden strata of meaning. While these traditions would not attain their full and intricate development until much later periods, their foundational roots can be unequivocally traced back to the immediate aftermath of the temple's destruction. The practice of Jewish magic and folk religion also experienced a significant flourishing during this period, as individuals ardently sought supernatural remedies for the tangible tribulations of life in diaspora. Amulets, incantations, and various ritualistic practices, meticulously designed to bestow protection, facilitate healing, and ensure success, became ubiquitous elements of Jewish popular culture. The rabbinical authorities harbored complex and nuanced attitudes toward these practices. On one hand, they expressed considerable apprehension regarding the encroaching influence of pagan magical traditions and the inherent potential for superstition to subvert rational and prescribed religious observance. On the other hand, they acknowledged the profound human need for sources of comfort and solace that extended beyond the provisions of formal religious institutions. The evolution of Jewish calendar systems and ritual observances necessitated a complete reevaluation in the absence of the central temple. The temple had historically served as the preeminent authority for determining the precise dates of religious festivals, establishing the correct procedures for ritualistic adherence, and resolving intricate disputes concerning religious law. With the temple no longer standing, these vital functions had to be judiciously distributed among various rabbinic authorities and local communal bodies. This decentralization led to some discernible variations in practice among different Jewish communities, yet it simultaneously underscored the remarkable flexibility and inherent adaptability of Jewish religious tradition. The observance of the Sabbath gained even greater prominence in the post-temple period, offering a vital weekly occasion for Jewish communities to convene, engage in scholarly study, and steadfastly preserve their religious identity. The elaborate rituals enveloping Sabbath observance functioned as a profound substitute for the temple service, effectively creating sacred time and space within the ordinary fabric of diaspora existence. The dietary laws, known as kashrut, also acquired heightened significance as crucial markers of Jewish identity. In a world where Jewish populations were dispersed among non-Jewish societies, the meticulous adherence to dietary restrictions served as a daily, tangible reminder of Jewish distinctiveness and as a practical, yet profound, barrier against complete assimilation. The intricate question of conversion to Judaism became notably more convoluted in the post-temple era. The temple had previously furnished a clear and established institutional framework for the conversion process, complete with specific rituals and designated authorities responsible for formally accepting new adherents into the Jewish community. With the temple's demise, local communities and rabbinical authorities were compelled to devise novel procedures for conversion. This complex process was further complicated by prevailing Roman attitudes toward Jewish proselytization. The Romans generally exhibited tolerance for existing religious diversity, but they harbored considerable suspicion of religious movements that actively sought to convert Roman citizens. Jewish communities, therefore, had to exercise extreme caution to avoid appearing overly aggressive in their missionary endeavors, while simultaneously preserving the genuine possibility for sincere converts to join their community. The development of Jewish perspectives regarding other religious faiths was also profoundly shaped by the temple's destruction. Some Jewish individuals, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, concluded that the event unequivocally demonstrated the superiority of pagan deities over the God of Israel, leading them to entirely abandon Judaism. Conversely, others formulated more sophisticated theological explanations that staunchly upheld Jewish monotheism, while concurrently acknowledging the temporary triumph of Rome and its pantheon of gods. The majority of Jewish people likely embraced some form of dualistic thinking, which sharply distinguished between the current age, wherein malevolent forces appeared to hold sway, and a future epoch, in which God would unequivocally establish his sovereign kingdom and unequivocally vindicate his chosen people. This conceptual framework allowed them to steadfastly maintain their faith amidst the harsh realities of their contemporary circumstances. The economic methodologies meticulously crafted by Jewish communities in the post-temple period would exert profound and enduring implications for the trajectory of Jewish history. The pronounced emphasis on trade and commercial enterprise, the strategic cultivation of intricate international networks founded upon shared religious and familial bonds, and the specialized concentration in particular economic sectors all became defining characteristics of Jewish life within the diaspora. These distinctive economic strategies were, in part, a pragmatic response to the systemic restrictions imposed upon Jewish participation in other facets of society. Jewish people were frequently barred from certain professions, prohibited from land ownership in specific regions, and largely excluded from full engagement in civic life. Commerce, therefore, emerged as one of the few viable avenues where Jewish individuals could attain substantial economic prosperity while simultaneously preserving their cherished religious identity. The establishment of Jewish charitable organizations proved absolutely vital for community survival during the post-temple period. With the central temple treasury no longer in existence, local communities were compelled to develop their own intricate systems for providing essential support to the impoverished, the ailing, and the elderly. These nascent charitable institutions subsequently served as exemplary models for similar organizations within the broader society, unequivocally demonstrating the profound Jewish commitment to social responsibility. The rigorous education of Jewish children became a matter of paramount and urgent concern for communities striving to steadfastly maintain their identity across successive generations. The rabbinical authorities firmly established the principle that every Jewish community bore the inherent responsibility to provide fundamental education for all children, not exclusively for those predestined for religious leadership roles. This unprecedented emphasis on universal education was remarkably unusual in the ancient world and would ultimately become one of the most distinguishing hallmarks of Jewish culture. The multifaceted role of women within Jewish religious and communal life underwent complex transformations during the post-temple period. While women had been largely excluded from direct temple service, they played absolutely crucial roles in meticulously maintaining Jewish observance within the domestic sphere and in diligently transmitting Jewish traditions to their offspring. Certain aspects of the post-temple era, in fact, inadvertently augmented women's religious significance. The heightened emphasis on domestic observance meant that women's intimate knowledge of ritual law became considerably more important. The progressive development of synagogue worship created novel opportunities for women's participation, although these opportunities were, regrettably, still constrained by the prevailing contemporary societal attitudes regarding gender roles. Attitudes toward gender roles. The evolution of Jewish jurisprudence concerning the sanctity of marriage and the procedures for divorce necessitated a profound reevaluation in the wake of the dissolution of the temple authorities, who had historically exercised supervisory dominion over these intimate and crucial matters. Consequently, local rabbinic scholars and respected communal leaders were compelled to forge and implement novel methodologies for the legitimate validation of marital unions, the equitable resolution of domestic disagreements, and the formal granting of divorce decrees. These burgeoning legal developments were rendered considerably more intricate by the dual imperative to steadfastly uphold traditional Jewish law, while simultaneously operating within the overarching jurisdictional framework established by Roman civil legislation. It became a critical concern for Jewish communities to ensure that their marital bonds and their dissolutions garnered official recognition not solely from their own religious tribunals, but also from the authoritative secular institutions of the Roman state. The formidable task of safeguarding Hebrew as a revered, sacred language grew increasingly challenging during the post-Temple epoch, particularly as Jewish populations found themselves dispersed across diverse territories, predominantly speaking Greek and Latin. An incessant external pressure mounted for the abandonment of Hebrew in favor of adopting the readily accessible local vernacular tongues. Despite this, the dedicated rabbis invested immense efforts into preserving Hebrew's preeminence as the indispensable idiom for prayer, intensive scholarly pursuit, and profound religious discourse. Concurrently, they pragmatically acknowledged the undeniable necessity of utilizing everyday vernacular languages for mundane daily communication, and even for specific devotional purposes. The subsequent emergence of Aramaic as a significant Jewish literary language, and later the judicious incorporation of Greek for certain Jewish religious texts, represented crucial pragmatic compromises, artfully balancing the lofty ideal of Hebrew's complete preservation with the immediate functional requirements of the geographically scattered diaspora communities. The trajectory of Jewish artistic expression and tangible cultural output in the post-Temple period vividly mirrored the community's persistent endeavor to uphold its distinct identity while adeptly adapting to radically altered circumstances. Jewish artists and skilled craftspeople were thus tasked with devising innovative modalities for articulating Jewish themes and deeply held values, consciously eschewing reliance upon former temple iconography, or inadvertently transgressing established religious prescriptions against particular forms of visual representation. In this transformative landscape, the synagogue ascended to become the foremost arena for Jewish artistic manifestation, distinguished by its elaborate decorative schemes, vibrant mosaic compositions, and distinctive architectural features that powerfully conveyed Jewish communal identity and cherished tenets. These burgeoning artistic developments unequivocally demonstrated the remarkable capacity of Jewish communities to maintain their singular character, even while actively engaging with and contributing to the expansive artistic traditions prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world. The profound question of how to perpetually recall and fittingly memorialize the destroyed temple emerged as a central and pervasive preoccupation for Jewish communities throughout their wide-ranging diaspora. A diverse array of rituals and established practices were meticulously cultivated to ensure the enduring vitality of the temple's memory and to articulate a fervent aspiration for its ultimate reconstruction. Among these, the solemn fast of the 9th of Av, specifically designated to commemorate the catastrophic date of the temple's obliteration, assumed its place as one of the most profoundly significant observances within the entire Jewish calendrical cycle. Distinctive supplications and elaborate liturgical compositions were specifically created to hallow this day, serving as poignant conduits for the community's collective sorrow and tenacious hope. These deeply ingrained commemorative practices functioned dually. They diligently safeguarded historical remembrance and steadfastly fostered the continuity of communal identity throughout successive generations and disparate geographical locations. The formation of Jewish perspectives concerning political governance was profoundly shaped by the traumatic experience of the temple's demolition. The calamitous defeat of the rebellion against the formidable Roman Empire prompted a significant portion of the Jewish populace to embrace more circumspect strategies regarding political involvement, prioritizing strategic adaptation and existential preservation over overt defiance and national sovereignty. This palpable alteration in political ideology found its articulation within the corpus of rabbinic doctrines concerning the intricate interplay between spiritual and temporal powers. Generally, the revered rabbis instructed that Jewish individuals ought to comply with the directives of the civil administrations governing their domiciles, provided that such authorities did not compel them to transgress core religious tenets. Simultaneously, these same spiritual guides steadfastly asserted that ultimate dominion resided with the Almighty, and that all human governmental structures were inherently transient and prone to error. This intricate equilibrium between pragmatic acquiescence and principled, theoretical dissent would subsequently define the trajectory of Jewish political philosophy for numerous subsequent centuries. The repercussions of the temple's obliteration on Jewish understandings of temporality and historical progression were exceptionally deep-seated. This singular catastrophe delineated an unambiguous schism between the biblical era, a time when the Jewish people possessed their sovereign territory and their consecrated sanctuary, and the subsequent rabbinic age, characterized by their dispersion amongst diverse peoples and their subjugation to alien potentates. This epical rupture in historical continuity engendered novel intellectual frameworks for contemplating Jewish fate and the workings of divine foresight. The learned rabbis meticulously formulated intricate hypotheses concerning the profound significance of exile and the requisite prerequisites for ultimate deliverance. They furthermore devised elaborate computations regarding the prospective advent of the Messiah and the prophetic indications that would herald the culmination of the present historical epoch. Such intricately conceived temporal constructs furnished both foundational coherence and profound significance for Jewish communities grappling with the arduous task of discerning their position within the vast sweep of human history. These frameworks not only extended a powerful promise of eventual vindication and ultimate restoration, but also imparted invaluable counsel on how to navigate and live devoutly and purposefully amidst the prevailing, often challenging, contemporary conditions of their existence. The evolution of Jewish jurisprudence and its associated logical frameworks during the post-temple era forged a suite of intellectual instruments destined to exert considerable sway over legal thought far beyond the confines of the Jewish populace. The erudite rabbis meticulously cultivated highly refined approaches for hermeneutics, adeptly mediating disagreements among divergent authorities, and skillfully extrapolating broad tenets to address particular instances. These sophisticated legal methodologies transcended mere technical applications. They vividly embodied more profound philosophical convictions concerning the intrinsic essence of veracity, the source of legitimate power, and the capabilities of human rationality. The distinctively rabbinic accentuation on dialectical discourse, the consideration of multifarious viewpoints, and the power of cogent argumentation fostered an intellectual milieu that profoundly esteemed erudition and incisive critical inquiry. The pervasive impact of this distinctive legal culture permeated beyond the sphere of religious statutes, influencing Jewish methodologies in secular scholarship, commercial dealings, and the structuring of social institutions. Indeed, the mental disciplines honed through rigorous legal scholarship became defining attributes of Jewish intellectual culture at large. Upon the culmination of this comprehensive inquiry into the obliteration of the Second Temple and its far-reaching consequences, it becomes unequivocally apparent that this singular occurrence, notwithstanding its inherent devastation, served as the pivotal impetus for one of the most extraordinary metamorphoses in the annals of religious and cultural evolution. The iteration of Judaism that rose phoenix-like from the smoldering remnants of the temple was, in numerous respects, a fundamentally reconfigured faith, meticulously calibrated for enduring existence within an environment devoid of the foundational institutions that had characterized Jewish communal life for centuries. The sagacious rabbis who meticulously orchestrated this profound transformation exhibited unparalleled ingenuity and unwavering fortitude when confronted with ostensibly insuperable adversities. They adeptly succeeded in safeguarding the intrinsic components of Jewish identity while simultaneously making crucial adjustments to drastically altered conditions. Through their leadership, they inaugurated novel institutions, introduced innovative rituals, and fostered fresh conceptual frameworks that would steadfastly uphold Jewish communities through nearly 2 millennia marked by dispersion and relentless oppression. The obliteration of the temple in 70 CE, therefore, signifies not the termination of Jewish civilization, but rather its profound metamorphosis into a configuration capable of enduring and thriving even amidst the most arduous circumstances imaginable. The resilient diaspora Judaism that materialized from the crucible of this catastrophe would ultimately demonstrate itself to be more robust and pliable than the temple-centric faith that had preceded it. The triumph of Rome, seemingly absolute at that historical juncture, ultimately revealed itself to be less conclusive than initial perceptions suggested. While the Roman Empire successfully dismantled the corporeal nexus of Jewish civilization, it proved incapable of eradicating the profound spiritual and intellectual wellsprings that would empower Judaism to reconstruct itself in novel manifestations. Indeed, the sheer totality of the physical devastation inadvertently compelled Jewish people to cultivate modes of religious and cultural articulation that exhibited diminished reliance on particular geographical sites and established institutional frameworks. Consequently, the chronicle of the temple's destruction and its subsequent repercussions transcends a mere recounting of military subjugation and religious cataclysm. It simultaneously unfurls as an inspiring narrative of human tenacity, inventive spirit, and the enduring potency of abstract concepts to persist even through the most utter physical obliteration. This historical account vividly illustrates the remarkable capacity of a people to safeguard their inherent identity and cherished principles even when divested of their ancestral territory, their pivotal institutions, and their sovereign autonomy. The profound insights gleaned from this transformative period resonate far beyond the confines of Jewish historical scholarship, serving to illuminate more expansive inquiries concerning the adaptive strategies cultures employ in times of crisis. The mechanisms by which religious traditions undergo evolution under duress, and the methods communities utilize to preserve their distinctiveness across temporal spans and geographical expanses. The Jewish reaction to the temple's demolition thus furnishes an exemplary blueprint for cultural endurance, offering salient applicability to countless other civilizations that have confronted analogous tribulations throughout the annals of time. Ultimately, the devastating destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE endures as one of humanity's most compelling historical paradoxes. It represents a profound calamity that paradoxically instigated a period of vigorous rejuvenation, a crushing military reversal that unexpectedly facilitated the very continuity of existence, and a conclusive termination that, in essence, inaugurated an entirely new epoch. The inferno that engulfed the sacred temple edifice in Jerusalem ultimately engendered a distinct manifestation of Judaism, a form of faith destined to not only endure beyond the lifespan of the mighty Roman Empire itself, but also to persist and flourish vibrantly well into the contemporary age. The inherent characteristics and distinctive qualities that defined a particular cultural or stylistic movement, having previously existed in a nascent or less recognized form, embarked upon a significant integration into the modern era. This evolutionary trajectory involved more than a simple chronological advancement. It represented a profound reinterpretation and adaptation of its core tenets to resonate with contemporary societal structures and technological paradigms. Experts observed a compelling transformation wherein these specific attributes, once perhaps confined to niche circles or considered merely experimental, progressively established their pervasive influence across broader cultural landscapes. The journey entailed a thoughtful assimilation of its unique essence, ensuring its relevance and vitality within the rapidly evolving frameworks of the current epoch.